Okay, so now today we're going to talk about writing. I'm very sad that this is a small audience because this is actually, this lecture and next week are the two, in my view, most fun but also most important lectures on helping you figure out how to write papers, which is primarily what your job has become. You are now a professional writer. The research is just to support writing the papers and doing those things. And what I'm going to talk about today and next week, and maybe that's why people aren't here, they watch the videos, they decide this is really not what you want to be. This is not how, as far as I can tell, any course on technical writing talks about technical writing. It's a very non-traditional approach of doing this stuff, but I think it works pretty well. My lab has won more than a dozen Best Paper Awards, so this stuff has turned into stuff that actually helps people get their papers not just published, but even winning Best Paper Awards and whatever. So let's start with, why are you writing a paper? Amy, why do you want to write a paper? To what? To record your research. Okay, well, so you can record your research without publishing a paper. So you're going to share it with other people. What do you want those people to do with it? Study, reproduce, build on your work, right? So anybody else, any different answers?
Well, for me, I'm taking this course to see if I like writing.
Okay.
You could say.
So that's a different answer, but assuming you did like writing, why would you be trying to publish your paper?
So I'll give the two extreme answers. The complete self-interest answer is I want to publish in order to graduate.
So yeah, that's you need
that's,
to,
that's,
right?
that's the one extreme. The other extreme is to contribute to human knowledge and advance it. So those are kind of the
Okay.
two extremes.
Okay. Yeah, neither fit where I'm going, but anyone else want to add one else? Why else would you publish? Okay. So it's not enough you can contribute to human knowledge, but what you really want to do is you want to have something that other people will use, right? It's not like I contributed and no one cared, right? I want to persuade people that my research is good and they should cite it and build on it, right? Which literally I'm writing to persuade people. Come on. Okay? So you're trying to persuade them, and really the art of persuasion is about getting your way, right? If you're not having a call to action of the reader, you're not persuading them. Okay? So you're trying to get the reader to do something to build on your work. Right? And that's what I call a call to action. Right? Call to action is anything where you want the reader to do something. In this case, you want them to try and build on your work, right? So what are the actions in a paper or in a proposal, right? What are the actions you're going to call the reader to do? So Amy mentioned some. She wanted them to replicate her work. Okay? Do you want them to just replicate it? Advance it, right? So oddly enough, you want to be the state of the art, and then you want people to beat you, right? Why? Why do you want people to beat you? So this is
There is always scope to improve.
There's always ways of improving, right? So chances are you didn't completely solve the problem, right? If you did completely solve the problem, then they can't beat you anymore. But there might be other dimensions in which they can do better. But why do you want them to do better?
Because it continues progress forward.
It continues progress for the field. It's part we all wanted to see the field progress. Why else would you want them to?
Well, it means what you were doing is relevant. It's actually,
If other people are building on it, it's very relevant. Yep.
you just got cited.
It is. You just got cited, right? If your work doesn't if their paper can't beat you in some way, they're not going to cite you, right? And to be honest, right, I've seen this from the other side. I've had papers that were so much better than the state of the art. And the problems that no one cited them for years because that was sort of it, right? And then you get cited because, well, so-and-so saw that problem. That's pretty much it, right? That's not really the best direction to go. So, and it wasn't actually in those works that I did that there wasn't any other direction to go. But I wrote them in such a way that I didn't give people the avenues. I didn't tell them the story to persuade them to work on this problem. I wrote them as though, see, I solved it, it's done. And when reading the paper, they didn't see a direction to go, so they went some other direction. You actually want to encourage people, you want to persuade them to build on your work. Okay? So, what does it mean to persuade? What does it mean to persuade somebody when they're reading your paper to build on it?
Give them proofs, results that gives them confidence or trust to believe in your paper.
Well, so that makes them believe in your paper. But our goal is to persuade them to do something with it. Not just to say, I believe that paper. I want them to do something with that paper, right? So it's about, when we'll go through this, you might not have the answer, right? But our goal by the end of the day will be to get you to understand how they can both remember your paper, think about it in a positive way, and be able to see other things to do. Okay? Now, and this is sort of an odd way of looking at it, but we'll come back to what's going to take to be persuasive. But before I get on to that, when we're talking about writing, organization and storytelling is way more important than grammar. Now, that might be my personal point of view because I'm dyslexic and grammar is tough, but grammatical errors are not good. But for the reader, they're not near as bad as these problems that I see frequently in papers. An illogical sequence of ideas, right? Where when you're reading it, you're asking, what are all these details when I don't even know the big picture, right? I'm sure as you've done some scans, you've been going through paper and it's like, I don't understand what I'm seeing as I go through this paper. It's a jumble of ideas, right? They might be good ideas, but they're not connected. They're not something I can build on. And if they're just a sequence of ideas, even if they're a logical sequence, right, you might not see what's going on and how you're going to do it. If there's no pattern of organization, is the section moving from the most important to the least important ideas or not, right? You can't tell from reading the paper. If it's a bunch of individual pieces that are not connected, you cannot see the story that connects them, then there's no flow of ideas. And you feel as you're starting over again with each new sentence or each new paragraph, right? These are common things you see in papers. The grammar for every paragraph is perfect, but you can't connect them in a meaningful way to understand what to do. And it's jumpiness, right? The topics seem to jump around. So you can't connect them, and if you can't connect them, you're not persuading anybody, right? You get little snippets of ideas, but you can't connect them in a way that makes you want to do anything with it, then that's not a paper you're likely to cite or build on. Right? So we want to talk about what does it take to organize our thoughts in a paper in a way that is going to be effective. So I like to think, we'll actually go through two, but I'll start with Oscar. Oscar will actually make it easy to remember. It's the shape of a statue. We're going to talk about the opening. It's a very broad hook. Right? It's a little funnel. Then we're going to set the stage. We're going to narrow down to the part of the story we're going to tell. We're going to talk about the challenge, the problem. This is in the narrow area. We'll have some actions, some experiments and algorithms, and then the resolution where we tie back to the opening and sort of show how this connected to the problem. And if we do this right, we get people connected, we narrow down to what we're going to solve, we go through, we solve it, and then we explain to them why it's both a bigger problem and there's more left to do. Right? The fact that we open back up at the bottom shows that there's a lot more to do besides the narrow piece we worked on. Right? We don't just end with a narrow piece, we want to make it bigger. Okay, so Oscar, opening, setting, challenge, action, resolution. Oscar, when we're going to go through it in more detail, Oscar is actually an approach to writing that can be applied almost recursively. My paper could have an introduction, related work, the problem I'm trying to solve, the experiments I'm going to solve, and then the conclusion, right? Those are the sections in a sort of standard way of looking at papers, or a common way of looking at papers. But I can use Oscar at the section, right, level. So in a section, I can have an opening, a setting, a challenge that we're trying to resolve, the action, and the resolution. And all of this can happen in the introduction. Because in the introduction, I'm opening the problem. I'm setting the stage. I'm talking, even though I have a section called related work, a little bit of the introduction talks a little bit about some of the problem. And what is the challenge that I'm going to have to relate to? Some of the related work, but not all. I'll talk a little bit about what in this paper am I going to solve, and then the resolution will be why, what are the contributions to this paper? What am I really done in this paper that's going to solve this, right? And at this point, I've just described the intro of the whole paper, although the whole paper's there. You can actually get back to Oscar even at the paragraph level, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. So there's another common format that I want to make sure I talk about, because you'll see it talked about in various other writings about science, and including Joshua's book, if you, which I mentioned last class, right? Which is what's called the I'm Rad format. Introduction, method, results, and or analysis, and discussion. And so you'll see lots of papers where literally these are the section titles. Not very often in computer science, but if you read biology papers, neuroscience papers, these will be the sections you will see in their journal, in their papers, right? And so this is a very natural way of relating the two. And when we go talk about this for the rest of science, it is really the most common structure is I'm Rad, in sort of the section and organization. If a number of methods were used to achieve directly related results for comparison, we might take the methods and results section and call it the experimental section, because I go experiment, result, or sorry, all in one section, and I call that all the experimental section. If the results are so complicated they need to be discussed immediately, I can actually have a results and discussion section, because I have result, discussion, instead of result 1, result 2, result 3, discussion 1, discussion 2, discussion 3. That just separates them too far. So they're not always in that structure, but what you'll see is that they're related when they put together. And the two of these are actually extremely related. So I can go through Oscar, opening, setting, challenge, and those are all related to introduction. The analysis and approach are a combination of methods and results, and depending on analysis could be the A for I'm Rad or N, in which case obviously those two would match up. But the sort of approach is the methods, and the action might be some of the results, and then the resolution and the discussion match up, right? So these are really just two different sets of framings that go on to the writing. This is very common for science. I didn't mention this, but Oscar's a way of writing a novel. Pure science fiction, right? It doesn't matter what I'm writing. Oscar is a classic writing technique that doesn't depend on what I'm writing. I can do short stories or whatever. I have some opening to my problem, my opening to the story, some setting where I talk a little bit about the characters, some challenges my characters have to overcome, some action that happens in the story, and then eventually there's some resolution towards the end of the story, right? That's how I write anything. This is really just how those map into what we want to do in science. And I'll come back and we'll talk about this. We'll relate back to it a little bit later. But I talked about writing and persuasion, and now I'm going to try and bring these together, because science writing, in my view, is persuasive storytelling. Okay? So I already we talked a little bit about why is it persuasion. I want to get people to do something. Okay? And we're going to talk about what does it take to make things persuasive. And then we're going to talk about what does it take to make it a good story. Okay? There's plenty of storytelling that has nothing to do with persuasion. It's a good time read. It's just there to read the story. There's plenty of persuasion that isn't a good story. Right? But we're going to put the two together. We want persuasive storytelling. So let's start with what is it that makes a presentation, writing or verbal, persuasive. So in my view, I'm going to go through 5 key elements of persuasive presentation. Like where I put stuff together. And it can be oral, and we'll do oral presentations later. It can also be at writing, in terms of writing. So it's important that it is action-oriented. It has an action-oriented style with energy. And you want to think about whatever you're saying in terms of the impact on the reader. Okay? Not the impact on you, the writer, the impact on the reader. So you don't want to be boring. You don't want to go into too much detail and have like in this one a bullets instead of right. It's not about giving the reader all the detail unless you've gotten the reader to the point where they're now asking you for that detail. So in a good way of presenting and writing, it's not about just giving them information. It's about the impact that information is going to have on them. And you want to figure out how to tell your story, we'll come back to the story piece in a bit, where you get that to be something that they're going to deal with, right? And what's interesting is that if I actually look at, and there have been some studies, and we'll talk about stickiness in just a little bit, but if I think about how much people remember and get out of something, and if I look at the word count, how much people can remember of your story go down the more I talk. The more words I have in my paper, the harder it is to remember a lot of stuff. The more energetic I am, the more I talk about its impact and what it will do, the more people remember it. Okay, so it's not, well, you might have a giant table of experiments and you need that for your credibility. You've got to get them to care about that enough that they can remember what's going on. And we'll talk about stickiness again in just a bit, right? But this is really, a sticky story is one that has a lot of energy and less words. Right? And so in our papers, I actually like to think of it as what should be in the appendix and what should be in the story. And if I could say the user doesn't need this to understand what I did and why they care, then I want to move it to the appendix. Now, not always, I'll put it in the experimental section, but it's not my core story. I want to be able to tell the entire story in a very few number of words. Because if I haven't told it in a few number of words, they're not going to remember it, if it's that complicated. So the next thing about persuasion and persuasive writing is what's in it for them. Okay, you're writing this paper, but your reader is reading it, right, from a different point of view. You're writing to tell them what I did. They're reading it, and they're trying to figure out what's in it for me, right? You've all now scanned lots of papers and browsed lots of papers, right? If in a couple of minutes you can't figure out what's in it for you, you're not reading this paper, right? You can't get an audience member if they can't figure out what's in it for them. So you got to take some time to have a preparation for the reader to see why this paper is of value. And then in the paper, you can prove to them that that value is delivered. But part of it is making sure that there's a carrot there for them, something where they can figure out, why do I care? Okay? If as a reader, I don't see a benefit, why would I care about the details? Right? Show the reader you're thinking about them, not you. And if in the introduction, you're showing them how this could be used in other problems, and that's one of their problems, now they care. If you talk to them about your problem, and you've solved your problem, why do they care? If you've solved your problem and it's a stepping stone so they can solve theirs, they will care. It's your job to show them how to use your work early so they care. Think about everything you're going to write in terms of its impact, not as information, right? You might have a section that says, you know, if you need to figure out how to do it, here's the algorithm, here's how it works, okay? At that point in time, as you've seen, right, you're now in your critical, creative read, right? You've already invested deep in this paper. So they go find the stuff they're looking for. You want it in there, but it's about the impact that's going to have when they're ready for that. Okay? The features of your work need to be explained to them so that the benefits become credible. They're not going to take the time to read through that math or that algorithm until you've convinced them it's worth their time, and then they will. And then you can work at the very end of your paper, the ending, the conclusion, is to work the benefits again. You're going to tell them, here's all the benefits of my work, but this time it's a call to action. Here are the future works that you could build on top of. Here's the other problems that would benefit from my work. So while we call it a conclusion, you actually want to think of it as a call. A conclusion is a call to action that now that you've read my paper, here's what you can go do with it. That's the real conclusion you want out of your paper. Any questions on what's in it for them? Can you think of the papers you've read or didn't read where you couldn't figure out what was in it for you? Right? If you can't figure that out, you're not going to keep reading it. Maybe because I signed it, but otherwise you instantly get there. So part of what we'll talk about today is how do you write for them to get the story? There's not one way, because why can't there just be one way to figure out what's in it for them? Why can't I give you a cookbook that says, here's how you answer that?
Different audiences.
There are different audiences. there isn't a reader, right? There's always a reader, but there's lots of them, and they have different things. So you're going to have to figure out, who am I writing for? What is my audience? Who am I trying to get a call to action to do something? Am I writing to somebody else who's new in my field, or somebody who's got a lot of experience? Because you write differently. We'll talk more about context and how that works in. Am I writing for somebody who is so advanced that they will just use my thing as a module, or somebody who's so naive they don't want to understand how it works, just how to call the module, right? Both of those might actually use my work without needing to know what's in the middle. But I got to explain to them what's its advantages. That's when I talk about the benefits, right? Those benefits and features are things that are very general. And so you want to explain them in ways that different groups of people. Should I write for an audience? Maybe not. Maybe I'm writing for multiple audiences at the same time, because I can see 2 or 3 groups of people who might read, who might approach my paper at the same time. And in fact, you probably should write for multiple things. Why might I not want to write my paper for just one target audience, one mindset of people?
You want to do the opposite.
You want to write for broad, right? Yeah. So, but there's actually a particular reason. So, who is going to read your paper first? They may, depending on where
your reviews.
Peer reviewers, right? So in fact, your first audience is the reviewer, right? And oddly, the reviewer may not be the broad audience, right? Reviewers might be people who were selected because they actually know enough about your work to critique it. And reviewers are often in a slightly different category. Reviewers have been assigned your paper. They didn't choose it, or rarely do they choose it. And they're expected to do a report. They're doing it for the work. They will go through your paper, right? So they're not actually, at a certain level, the same group in terms of the features and benefits, right? One, they actually know a lot more about the field. And 2, they don't have to be motivated to read the entire paper. Does that make sense? It's completely wrong. So despite that I described it that way, reviewers are overworked to the point where you do have to motivate them to want to read your paper, because the papers that they're not motivated to read, they're not likely to rank very highly in the reviewing process. So you can't say they're going to read the whole paper. I guarantee you, I've seen lots of reviews that it's very clear they didn't read the whole paper, right? Because the statements they make about the paper are answered explicitly in section 2 or 3, right? We can tell them the line numbers in which the questions they say, it's not in the paper doesn't address this. It's like, it's section 2.3. Right? Okay, so they didn't read it very carefully. They may have scanned little bits of it, right? So even the reviewers, you have to motivate to read your paper. They may not be motivated for the same reasons, but if the paper's hard to read and whatever, they're not going to go through it. So relating to that is the way people read. And so you've all been pushed to read a lot quickly. And my guess is you'll sort of feel this, but from various studies of data, 79% of the people don't actually read. They scan, which I'm not trying to train you to do, right? They're not really looking through the entire paper, at least early on, right? They're sort of skimming through it, looking for stuff. So things like headlines, bullets, bold and italics, right? You put bold in the middle of a paragraph and it captures their eye. Gotta read this, go back and read. They know there's something important here. Otherwise, this whole paragraph can just be skipped over. So reviewers especially, but readers of a particular venue, they expect things to be in place in a section order, and they really expect the first sentence of a paragraph to be key. Right? How many of you have read a paragraph, read the first sentence, and then skipped to the next paragraph? Every one of you? Okay? If not, you didn't practice your scanning very fast, because you can't scan if you read every line of every paper, right? You've got to find some balance. But when we write, we try and teach you the first sentence of a paragraph is your thesis sentence. That sentence should tell me what this paragraph's about. And if I read that sentence and that's not relevant, then the entire paragraph is not relevant, and I skip it. Images convey a lot more forcefully than text could. I'll come back to, we'll have some more data on that in a second, right? Charts, graphs, high quality photographs, those things really capture people's attentions more than just words. Captions, the thing underneath the under the figure, get read by 50% more readers. We'll call them readers, right? Obviously, if they're true readers, they would have read everything, but 50% more of them will read the caption than the body of the text. And they will often have nearly 100% recall in a short time period, like 5 minutes later, of what they read in captions, compared to like 20% of what they read in text. So this is why we've already talked a little bit about this, and we'll talk about it multiple times throughout the semester. Writing the comic book version of your paper with figures and captions is critical, because people, not only do they often read that to get a sense for the paper, they actually, more of them will read more of them, and then they'll recall more of what was in your paper. So you're going to want that, okay? And actually, if we go back to the slide I had a couple things ago with word count, right? Increasing word count decreases stickiness. How do I have an 8-page paper and decrease the word count? More figures. The more figures I have, the less words I have. So I actually simultaneously get more visual content and less words. And you got to find the balance between trying to figure out how you put those two in there. So if we look at the way we put together a paper, so we have sort of the headline, these things we call leads, which are the lead-ins of the various sections. We might have a proof, we might have a bullets, right? We put together these things in our body where we have visual separation, right? There was actually a paper, I don't know if it ever got published, but it was a paper that analyzed the content of CVPR, my conference, and took the images, and took a paper and reduced it down to, for every page, they made it into a 1,000 by 800 image, right? So like 8.5 by 11. They shrunk everything down. So the image is very small. You cannot read the text. You cannot read a single letter. And they then made a data set where they took the accepted papers and the papers that showed up at workshops. So they're not as often the rejected papers from the conference show up in a workshop. And they were able to, just looking at that images, predict 75% of the time if a paper came from a conference or the main conference or a workshop. Right? Which their view was, we can tell you by how it looks without ever reading the content if this made it to the main conference or not. How do you think that, it was astounding when people first did it, and then it became obvious later, right? Why could you tell? Well, because there's structure in what we expect in a paper in terms of the headings, the spacing, the figures, where there will be bulleted items. Right? I can tell that there's a bulleted list at the end of the introduction without ever reading it, right? I can tell if I have a section where there's a bunch of math, which you might feel is still important. I can tell where the images are, right? All of those things are visually represented at very low resolution. But these are all parts of a good paper. So we want to get to the end and have a call to action, okay? And one of the reasons we want to do this is related to what we call the climbing the mountain of emotional intelligence, of emotion to get to memory. So emotions are physiologically like neon signs for our memory. Literally, when you feel a strong emotion, your amygdala releases chemicals that get used to help form new memories. Biologically, we've evolved, and we know that emotional states are things we need to remember. Now, is it true we can get this in our science papers? It's a little tough. It's not the most emotional space, but you can still get to where people expect to go. So we want to think about having a hook, it's a fish hook, right, at the beginning of our paper that gets people in. And then we want to have this building crescendo where we get them a little bit farther up, then we can relax a little bit, then we're going to build them up a little bit again. And to be honest, right, some of the sections may not get, these gaps may be lower, right, unless they really care. But at the very end, we want them to say, I'm going to do something with this paper. Now, this is not necessarily the order in which they read the paper, although I've drawn it here this way, right? The energy and emotion might be the way people scan the paper. They look at the abstract, they look at the conclusion, they go through the paper in a non-linear order. But the whole point is, if I can't keep them more and more interested, then what happens? They stop reading. It goes into the I'm not reading this paper anymore pile, right? Which happens to lots of papers, right?
Stickiness.
The stickiness, well, so that's actually, stickiness is about how long I remember it, right? But if you're trying to get somebody to go through a paper at a level they're going to build on, are they going to build on your paper if they don't even read it in detail? No, so you got to dig deeper. So you want the story to be read such a way that they get excited, that makes them go read a little bit more. To be honest, when they read a little bit more, they might lose a little bit of energy, but then they get more energy and they go back into the paper. And so you want to think of this as this growing crescendo of things. And part of that, in my view, is at every major part of the paper, there should be something visual that grabs them because, right? We all know that a JPEG is worth 1024 words, right? Or a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? We want to get them looking at this stuff and going on to the next level so they have something to remember. But now let's get back to what makes things stick. There's a whole book made to stick about how, it's largely about marketing, but the ideas of how do we make things in a way that people will remember. So the sticky stories, right, are really come down to this acronym, success. Okay, so success is what it takes to make a story sticky. First, it's simple. It has something that is unexpected. It is concrete, credible, some emotional attachment, and then stories. And that spells success. So you want to plan for success. Simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories stick. So from a science point of view, simple is pretty straightforward, right? I'm just going to take this really complicated thing and make it simple. Okay, I will tell you that's actually part of the hard part of good science, is how to take something complex and turn it into something that at least sounds simple. Okay, it may not even be exactly correct, but if you can have a 2-sentence version of this that you can get your 4-year-old niece, or sorry, 4th grader niece, 4-year-old's really tough, but a 4th grade niece, right, to understand what it is you do, then you've got a story that every reader can remember. It's simple. Is it exact? No. But it's really simple that will help them. Now, it turns out the next one is very important and is completely in your control, which is unexpected. So how many of you have read a paper where you didn't expect something and it sort of shows up? Any of you remember something from a paper? Now, part of that, why do I say that unexpected is entirely in your control? Because you're telling the story. It could be obvious once I tell you, but if I take you along for a little way and then all of a sudden the answer appears, it's actually unexpected. Right? So you can make it sound like, this is really hard, no one's been able to do this, but hey, we solved it, right? Now I've made it sound unexpected as opposed to, well, we just did what they did, we added this little twist and now it's obvious, right? You tell the story. If the readers think what you did was obvious, your paper will probably be rejected. If you tell them a story that makes it seem not obvious, right, you still run the risk they'll say, yeah, but if you looked at it this way, it was obvious, right? But you have a chance of making it unexpected. And sometimes the unexpected is, this worked even though it doesn't sound like it will, right? And you describe it in such a way, it's like, well, I'm not sure this will work. And then see it does.
Sometimes, like, what methods work in one field, when they apply it to another field, that approach also feels unexpected.
Yeah, so sometimes things that everyone thought would work and fail, that's also unexpected. Now you have to be careful that it didn't fail because of your mistake, but that can happen. One of our papers from last year, actually, we got some very unexpected results, and the reviewers were like, these results are not at all expected, and we had no explanation. We'll come back to that in a second, right? They were unexpected, and we couldn't explain them, and the reviewers beat us up correctly, because we then discovered it was a bug in somebody else's library. Right? They were so unexpected because their code was wrong. It wasn't our code, but hey, the reviewer still held us responsible. So when you find something that is unexpected, you're eventually going to have to tell a story that connects it and gets it so that they can relate there, which comes back to your credible. It's unexpected because I can explain why. Not it's unexpected and we have no idea why. The answer, if you can't explain it yet, is go do some more research and come back when you can. But unexpected and explainable is good. Sticky stories have to be at some level concrete. They have to be related to something the readers can feel they understand. So concrete doesn't mean physical. It doesn't mean something that is tangible. It means something that is an example, a concrete example. So if you can tie it back to, here's a real world situation where it happens, it's concrete. If I can turn it back into something that other papers have already talked about, it might be concrete, depending on what if those papers are concrete, then it is. And concrete and credible are actually related. Credible is the way in which I relate these things good? Right? If I can explain why it was unexpected and why it happens. Right? If I cannot explain why my algorithm works, I'm not credible. Right? Did you do your experiments wrong? Are your numbers completely made up? Right? So if you're thinking about it from a really aggressive negative reviewers, did a computer algorithm generate this paper and just stick bits and pieces together in a table of numbers? Right? That is the most aggressive view a reviewer can. But since papers have been routinely now submitted to conferences, every conference is a little bit gun shy of being another conference that accepts a computer-generated paper that is just made up. It's really bad for your conference when it happens. But the people who are writing paper generators, this is a little bit of an adversarial process, right? They're getting better at writing non-real papers, generating papers. We have to be good at detecting them and rejecting them, right? So every reviewer is on the lookout for those papers that are just made up. So if it's not credible, if you have this followed by something that makes, right, most of them now are no longer gibberish, right? The paragraphs are there, but the results just can't be explained. You can't explain how you get these results, then your paper will die. Now, emotional. So again, the paper, or the book studying sticky stories, right, was mostly about marketing. And obviously in marketing, emotional stuff is very important. But what can I talk about emotional from a science point of view? What's the emotional part of a sticky story from a science view?
Sometimes it's the excitement of how you can apply it to new problems, or especially from a research perspective.
Right. Yeah. So whose emotion are we talking about? The reader's emotion. Right? So you don't have to worry about how do I make, a 22-year-old mother of two buy something, right? That's a marketing emotional story. Right? You've got your target market. Your target market are the reviewers and the academic audience you're writing to. So what gets them excited? Things they can build on, things they can use. Now, sometimes you can actually talk about the importance of the underlying problem. I do work with guys who are trying to deal with soldiers and people of domestic violence who are suffering from PTSD. We can talk about the emotional toll underlying those people and maybe try and get some of the audience to feel emotional about this is an important problem. Even if the results are, not that's great, right? Somebody should be working on this problem. And this space of education, and there are aspects of computer science where you can get to the emotion of the end user's problem. Not necessarily the readers, but the end users, and make that happen. So, but some level of emotion is important. Why? Because if they don't care enough to feel anything, they're much less likely to do anything with it. Now, there are some people who don't have much emotion, so it doesn't take a lot to get them to want to care about it, but the emotion might be, I see how I can benefit from it. That's an emotional state. I can benefit from taking this, right? And then finally, stories and stick, there's not much we do. So this brings us, this was the last of my 5 key points for persuasion. Okay, now, one of the other things that I've already hit 3 examples of today, that to me is also part of persuasion. Anyone want to guess what those are? There's an element of persuasion which is not quite as general, but I believe it's actually very important. I will give you a hint. There's one on the screen right now. Do you think you can remember some of the things I talked about today, like Oscar and sticky stories?
Forget what they're called.
Acronyms, right? So, but these are acronyms are just any combination of letters that help you remember, right? These are mnemonic acronyms, and so you can have mnemonics that are not acronyms. But my view is I like mnemonic acronyms, right? Literally, the words spell out a piece of your story. Okay, and that helps them be concrete. But it also helps them be memorable, right? So there's a whole piece of it, right? So you can put them all together. And you'll notice when I talked about Oscar, right, I had this sort of funnel thing, but then I actually showed a picture of like the Oscar, the Emmys or whatever we give out, right? Shape is a little bit, right? Broad shoulders, right? But things like that, visual things, can help people remember part of their story to make it stick, okay? And I sort of got that earlier, right? Images are more sticky than words, right? So if I can tie something to an image, I can often make it stick. But I got to tell the right story. These elements go on with a picture, it's memorable. Mnemonics, things that help people remember what's going to go on, those are good. So if you can, in your paper, right, if you keep referring to our algorithm, that's okay. People know it's your algorithm, right? But do they remember what your algorithm was, what your algorithm did? So one of my company's products or projects, we called Finder. And it was a long acronym, standing for facial recognition, infrared recognition, right? So it was a long acronym. But for our military companies, right, it was all about using long-range night vision to recognize people long distances, to find them, right? It was instantly recognizable to them when we were talking about stuff, right? It was literally also something we could trademark, because I also make them. This one is a mnemonic that's completely normal. I like to make mnemonics that are slight misspellings, because then you can literally own the word. That's a business piece, but if it's not the normal word, you can trademark it. If it's a normal word, it's really hard to trademark. So coming up with some mnemonics as you're writing your paper can help you remember it, and importantly, help your audience remember the key elements of your story. So, where do you want to go?
My senior in the lab, like they were working on intrusion detection, and it was like anomaly based, and the words arranged such that with some modification it would be like you said you can't.
Said you can't? Yeah. Right, so and that's the kind of stuff. So there's actually a tool that I use all the time. Oh, hey, why not? We'll just go. Just because since it came up now, I have no place in particular I wanted to cover this. So, but you'll actually see this is my toolbar, right? How things I go to all the time. There's this tool called Outlook. Outlook. Come on, there we go. Outlook is really the only dictionary I use, which is good for writing in many ways. But this is a dictionary for computer scientists that are really useful, because I'm trying to find an acronym. So unlike most dictionaries, this supports various kinds of wildcard replacement. So if I wanted to say, I want something that starts with an F, has some number of letters, followed by a B, followed by exactly one letter, followed by an E, right? You'll notice it's already just filling in possible words. But even more important, and I want to relate that to complexity, well, that's probably security. Right? So here, oh man, that's too weird. Okay, let's say something that starts with a B, has a C. No, fine. Something that starts with an F, ends with an E, and is related to security. So fire safe, fire insurance, force, right? This tool will let you go back and forth and find words. So it's also just, what I'm using here is the thesaurus mode. The colon security says words related to the stuff that comes after it. And then everything else before it is like things. So words that have a particular meaning. So this can be good as a writing tool in general when you know this word is out there, right? There's a word that begins with an F and it's related to security. I mean, that's security, trying different. And so words that start with an F that are related to complexity, right? You choose a concept, and it doesn't have to be starts with. I can put the letters anywhere. So something that has an F in it is related to complexity. Now I will get lots and lots of words. And so you can use this to refine your words. I can find only the lists that are nouns or adjectives. And if you get to something that's really short, so right, there's next results, right? So now there's hundreds of them, right? And you can filter all kinds of things. And then there's another tool called Acronym Finder that will actually help you find acronyms. Those are the two things for those. Got wandered off on those. Okay. But that was a good place to transition, because now I'm going to talk about writing as storytelling. So if you actually ever take or do a course on storytelling from a true storyteller's point of view, we talk about the storytelling triangle. So in the storytelling triangle, there's me, the storyteller, the story, and the audience. And as I tell a story, especially an oral storyteller, but no matter how I'm trying to tell the story, there's a mediation between me the story, and the audience. And I control how the story is revealed to the audience with some objective that I'm trying to get to happen. So from a science point of view, from a telling our paper's point of view, I like to extend this beyond the storyteller's triangle to the science storyteller's tetrahedron. Because we're scientists, we want more complicated dimensions, so we do a tetrahedron. Because beyond the story, there is the scientific truth. Right? Our goal is often to help reveal the scientific truth. But the story I tell may not exactly be the scientific truth. In fact, it generally isn't. Why isn't the story I tell the scientific truth? We don't have the whole truth, right? If it was, we wouldn't be doing research on it. At best, we have an idea what is the scientific truth. Right? That's our best reason. Why else, besides the fact that we don't know the truth? Let's say I actually did know the truth. Why might my story not be the truth?
Well, the point of the story is to keep them interested, right? To kind of get to the truth.
Right. So the goal of our story is to get the audience to the truth, but not necessarily tell them the truth. Why? Because if I told them the truth up front, they might stop reading. They might not get there. Our goal is to get them through this story to some path that gets them towards the truth. So in the storyteller's triangle, we mediate between literally being in the story and the audience, and me as a storyteller, my energy and stuff to help guide them where we need them to get them to go, so they finally understand the story. And in the scientific storytelling tetrahedron, our goal is to use the story to help get the audience closer to the scientific truth. And if we don't know the whole truth, we can't get them all the way there, but even if we know the whole truth, it may still be a process to get them there, because they don't know enough to understand the story of the scientific truth if I just told it to them. Literally, they might not have the vocabulary to understand it. So we have to help the story get them to understand the words we use, the context we have, what's been going on before this, so they can get to the full understanding of the scientific truth. So as we go to build this tetrahedron, I'll talk a lot about the sort of the tetrahedron's elements in terms of the story and the audience and how we go back and forth and try to help them. Okay, but we're going to take that back and now talk about this from a storyteller's point of view. So there are two halves to the word: story and telling. Right? Although it's one combined word, it's not two words, storytelling, right? But it really is a concatenation of those two words. So we have to worry about what is the story, and then how do we tell it? Okay, and those two will come back and forth. So the core of a story, what makes a good story? So in a good story, we're going to have 8 characteristics of a good story. We're going to have our character, or characters. And those characters are going to have to climb over some obstacles and conflicts. They're going to have to deal with those, make it through some risks and dangers to reach their goals. These are the classic elements, again, of stories, not about scientific papers.
We've got the setback. Setback. What's going to happen with the hero's journey?
With the hero's journey, well, so along the way in the risk and dangers, you often have to, the dangers send you back, right? You don't always have to, but it's always a risk, right? So that's in the risks and dangers, right? And very often you do send them back, right? But this is classic hero telling, story tales, right? Every good story has these elements, okay? Now, how is this related to a science paper, right? Well, what you want to do is write a paper that gets people to build on your work. How is it related to these things? Well, it turns out if you understand how to tell a good story, you can tell a better story from a paper point of view. Okay? Now, since what you want, what you need to have happen and what you want aren't always the same thing, right? You can't always get what you want. But if you really, you might just, but if you try sometimes, yeah, you might just find you get what you need. So writing your story is not just for the final audience. As you go through this way of looking at your work, as you deal with the 8 essential elements of a good story, you may actually come to a deeper understanding of your own problem. And once you understand what the problem really is and how to convey that to people, it will change the way you approach your science. So one of the things I said, my students and I will often talk about the story of our paper long before we run all the experiments. Now, from a pure scientist point of view, there's a little bit of a problem with that, because we normally have this idea of a scientist has a hypothesis. We go out and we run experiments to test that hypothesis, and then we write a paper. That is the normal way of thinking about that. In which case, maybe there's a problem, but these risks and dangers and the conflicts, whatever, right? None of those show up if I just follow the pure scientific hypothesis. But maybe they do. What in here could you view from these elements, right? From a pure scientific hypothesis test point of view? What are the issues I face that show up in this story? No, I'm just, like, for some reason, oh, I see, I come back to it later. Okay, it's like, I thought I had different next slide, but okay. All right, so I'll come back to that. You'll think about it as we go through what some of these traits are. We'll come back to where you sort of get there. Okay, so these are the 8 essential elements of a good story. We have some character and character traits. Okay, and the character traits are those things that make the character interesting. And I put these in red because these are the most important. Any good story has a character. We have goals and motives. I'll come back to the difference between those in a second. We have conflicts and problems, risks and dangers, struggles, the hero struggle, we've got to have those struggles, and then the details. Okay, and the details, right, are various levels. Details can actually occur across all of these, but character traits are so important to detail that we consider those to be their own category. So if we look at those 8 essential elements in terms of a story, right, so we care about who is the main character. What character traits makes them interesting? What do the characters need to do or to get, right? That's their goal. Why is that goal important? What is the motive? What conflicts and problems block the character? What makes it difficult for them to do? How do they create risk and danger? That is, that conflicts and problems create the risks and dangers, not the characters. What does the character do? What struggles do they have to do they overcome as they try and reach their goal? And then what sensory details make the story seem real? What makes it concrete? Okay, so adding descriptions and stuff that go in. Now, again, this is classic storytelling. Okay? But it all applies, come on, mouse. It all applies to our science storytelling. So, who's the main character? Well, in most of the papers you will write, your main character is an algorithm, a system, or a theory. Right? The science you are trying to do is your main character. What are the character traits? Well, what helps the reader remember why what you do is important or detail, right? So my algorithm has some algorithmic details. My theory has some things, the details about it, right? So the character traits are both about the character, in this case a little bit about the problem. Those are some of the details. What does the character need to do or to get, right? Oh, I just remember I should point on here for the recording. So what's the measure by which, so we have a goal, right? Our goal is to beat the state of the art in our paper by some measure, right? So what do we need to do? What is that goal? Our goal is, here's a measure and we're going to do better at this measure than anybody else. Now, what's the motive? Okay, the motive is for the goal is for the character. The motive is for the reader. Why do I care that the character gets to that goal? That's my motive. So what are the properties? Why is that property important? Why do I care that I've got an algorithm that's faster, cheaper, more privacy enhancing, whatever, right? Fits in less memory. So those two are describing characters about how I'm measuring my performance and why people care. What are the conflicts or problems that block the character? Explain to me why this problem is hard, right? Not as trivial, right? If the answer is, look, I just sorted the data and the answer is there, right? There's no problem and no one will care about your algorithm, right? But if the data can't be sorted because you can't know it enough, right? You don't want to get to all of it. Or maybe it's because analog N is just too expensive, right? N so big I have to do it in sublinear time. I can't even look at all the data. If I look at all the data, I'm doomed, right? Okay, well then that becomes your problem. You got to figure out what makes this problem hard to do. what are the risks or danger if it's not successful, right? Can you give me something that makes me as a reader care what happens when this doesn't work? What does the character do to reach the goal? So from a paper point of view, this might seem like, well, what are you going to do, right? So I set up here the goals are what are the important properties? How do you convince me that those properties are the things that actually matter? That's the struggle you have to overcome. So we call these things, very often they're called ablation studies, where I might take that property and I vary it in some dimension to sort of see how the system responds to it. Or I take that property away. And if I don't have this property, I fail, right? Something like that. So experiments that really help you understand what parts of it make it work. And we want to relate this back to the traits, the character traits, that we said are important about our character, right? And you show that those traits really are the trait that matters for the character. Okay, and then sensory details will make the story seem real. What examples do you have to sort of get the reader to feel they understand? Notice I didn't say actually understand. Feel they understand. They look at your examples, they think they understand how things work. But also, if you really want to make the story seem real in science, and in general, right, you also want to talk about some failure cases, things where it didn't work. Because no algorithm does everything. So if you don't understand what are the limitations of your algorithm, why do I think your algorithm is real? You're just telling me, you're painting me a pretty picture, you're not showing me any of the real world, which is often uglier. So you want to have some failure cases, or at least talk about them. So something that adds some details that make the story seem real. So I'm better at A, B, C, and D, but it came at a cost. I did E. More memory, more cost, more time, whatever, or just there are certain cases I can't handle. Whatever that is, you want that adds some details. So does this now connect standard storytelling to the science story? You see how you can do this, right? By taking your elements and taking your elements of your science and turning them back into these. Okay? And if you're going to do a good job telling a story, now I can come back to that drawing I had. And so here is your science story, right? So your character is your science and its properties, your algorithm, your system, whatever's going on. The problems and conflicts are really the problem that you're trying to solve, but also the limits of the state of the art. You want to tell them the state of the art can only do this. We have to get farther than that to make an advance. The risks and dangers are why the character might fail. What happens if it does, right? Why do I care about this problem? And then, of course, the final goals are to beat the state of the art at the way you set this problem up. So that gets you most of the core elements of a good theory. Now, if you're telling the story, sometimes you can even add some other elements. It's not uncommon for the hero of the story to have to go back and redo something. Right? You can actually make some of those details, these ones I talked about, failure cases, right? You can actually talk about, we tried this and it failed. We tried that and it failed, right? What does that do? What other element does that, if you talk about one or two things you tried that didn't work, what else does it add beyond the sensory details from the 8 essential elements? Right, so it comes back, so coming back to these conflicts and problems, right? It wasn't easy, right? See, we tried these other things and they failed. It makes the readers both see that the character, the main character, the one who's going to win, wasn't easy, right? They had obstacles to overcome. It makes the audience see you as a writer, as a scientist, had things you had to overcome. This problem is not trivial, right? Because if you just show them this beautiful solution, they think, oh, that was great, it was trivial or simple, right? No, to get to simplicity, you often have to go through very complicated processes to reduce the problem down to what makes it simple. And this is also why I like to say, if you do this right, it will help you understand your science. Because if you sit down and try and identify what are the conflicts or problems that block your character, how does that help you with your science? It can help you focus, right? In fact, if you do it right, it may help you focus on what really are the core problems, right? So problems, conflicts, right? What are the limits of the state of the art? The more you look at that and say, here's the problem with the state of the art, not just say, I want to do better than that, right? It doesn't solve this aspect of the problem, or it fails for this reason. When you can identify a gap the state of the art doesn't do, You've identified the conflict that you're going to overcome for your character. Now you know what problem to work on. Because if you chose that the dimension and you've chose a way of measuring it, you can go out and try and figure out, are you going to solve it? Does it give you a way to solve it? No, but at least you're working on a problem that's worth solving. Once you understand all of this, right, notice, except for maybe a little bit down here in sensory details, maybe a little about the character struggles, right? This is why I think you can do good science with this approach. We know the story. Nowhere in here did I say what the answer was, right? The hypothesis was there's a problem worth solving. There's a set ways of measuring it, right? Does my algorithm work? Maybe not. My students and I have talked about the story of our paper and then gone down and you run the experiments and you don't solve the problem. What happens then? Well, that's not a paper, right? But you might have learned along the way, and now you reiterate, you modify the story, right? And all of that stuff you tried becomes a paragraph. We tried this, it didn't work. Now you try the same story again. You've attacked the problem, you've got the measures. Now sometimes, right, the measure is the goal we're going to try and do, right? Sometimes we recognize that goal is currently unattainable. But I might have noticed other things I can do, and now I can change my goal, right? I don't rewrite my science to fit the experiments, but I might from the experiments get insights that let me change to a different problem slightly. Change my goals, and now I can do that, right? So maybe my algorithm wasn't more accurate than the state of the art, but maybe it was 4 times faster. Now I rewrite the paper saying, I'm getting comparable accuracy at 25% the cost. That's a reason to keep the paper, right? So you figure out what the story is, and then as you learn, you can make that part better. Okay, so let's talk about the sort of science behind stories for science, but really, this is the science behind stories. The 4 science is just my little, trying to keep it related to this class, but this is really about the science of storytelling and stories, right? So, it's in 3 parts. The science of story structure, anticipating the mind of the audience, and the story process. So I'll go through each of these. So what do I mean, the science of story structure? Well, people learned to read, or at least most people, around 200 years ago. So it's not that we read stories, right? We've only been doing this for a little bit of time. We learned about logic and argumentative forms, verbal stuff, 3,200 years ago, Greeks. We learn how to write. The most advanced individuals learn how to write 7,000 years ago. So storytelling isn't really even about that. We learn how to tell stories as long as humans have been in existence. 100,000 years, every year, for long periods of time, the majority of human history, the only way information was conveyed was through oral storytelling. So the 100,000 years, so about 93,000 of our years, right? Storytelling was the dominant form of human interaction. We learned to communicate, to archive knowledge, wisdom, learning, facts, values, beliefs, everything, right? Through storytelling. Now, in the literature of storytelling, they literally say, we have evolutionally rewired humans to think in specific storytelling terms. And I like to point that out because to me this is like where they just completely went off the rails, right? We were not evolutionarily rewired to be storytelling. What's the more likely explanation from a science point of view? Rewiring our brains, which are millions of years of evolution? Nah. Really. What happened is storytelling evolved, right? To use models that match how humans think and can remember, right? Humans didn't evolve to storytelling. Storytelling evolved to match how humans think and remember stuff. But if I have to go through oral stories year after year and pass down knowledge, if I don't do that right, the knowledge gets lost. So those stories die off. And the things that make storytelling work are those things that have worked for a very long time. So ancient stories work out. So the human brain is really pre-proposed to think in storytelling terms, right? Or, as I said, the storytelling terms that we talk about are what we know is about how humans work, how humans try to understand, how to make sense, and how to remember. So just as a few little examples, let's play with a little bit. So imagine the following story. Where's John? Person 2. Well, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw a green VW parked in front of Carol's place. 2 sentences. What do you think? Okay? I doubt any of you said there's literally no connection between those two sentences. Okay? Did anyone say it makes no sense? No. To you, you fill in stuff. The human mind automatically assumes there's a connection. And we fill in things to make sense out of it. Right? We use storytelling structures to fill in the missing information. So one way of thinking about it is like the story was actually closer to this. Hi, John. Shh, I'm not here. You never saw me. I'm not here. It's okay. Carol's gone home, right? Like literally, you filled in parts like John was doing something inappropriate. Why? What in this story tells you? Oops. Come on. No. What in this story said John's doing something inappropriate? Right. I didn't want to say anything but, right? So person two is, the way they're phrasing it is telling you they think something's wrong about what John's doing, right? Like John's in front of Carol's house, right? Nothing in the story said that, right? But the way it's phrased and the way the story puts stuff together, the human mind wants to connect stuff. We are, in fact, most of most of nature, right, our brains are doing lots of pattern matching. We're trying to find connections. Connections in space-time are part of how we think. And so that storytelling structure allowed us to go a little bit farther and say, you know, Carol's not here or whatever, so we're connecting those things. So that's about what's going to happen. Now, how do we exploit that when we're telling a story? We want to anticipate the mind of the audience. Now, if there's more than one audience, we've got to anticipate multiple minds to make it work. But we want to know what's going on. So what's the first thing we have to worry about in terms of anticipating the mind of the audience? Well, it's about their prior knowledge. Banks of existing knowledge and experience about a relevant topic or a narrative structure. That's our prior knowledge. We need to use that information about what we believe is about the audience, their prior knowledge, to relate what we're going to do. Okay? So prior knowledge and context creates new information. Story structure makes that information relevant. So we're going to connect them, right? The magic ingredients of context are the surrounding parts that determine the meaning of the background, and relevance applies a close relationship or importance. So we want to use context to make things relevant. And as we use that context, right, and how we do things, we literally want to use the space-time of our story. We connected John and Carol in that story because in space-time, one statement followed the other, right? If the statement, "Where's John?" happened, and then 3 paragraphs later we said, "I didn't want to say anything, you know, something about Carol," right? Then they seem disconnected. It is only because of space and time that our brains make those hard, quick connections. So this is critical when you're telling the story, when you're writing, because the distance you separate things changes how people perceive what they are. Okay? And to sort of really make that example come home, we're going to talk about prior knowledge and spacing. So I'm going to give you, I think there's 10 groups with 25 letters. In 10 seconds, I want you to try and memorize these letters. Should have the stopwatch ready earlier, but. Okay, that was 10 seconds. So, how many letters do you think you can recall? First two? Okay, so the average in various experiments, not exactly these numbers, I've changed them, but in general, with 25 letters, people can remember maybe 8 or 10. Depends on what's going on, right? But as I said, humans we're spatiotemporal beings in terms of how we deal with stuff. So different spacing will evoke different prior knowledge, okay, and context. So I will just change the spacing. There are the same letters. Exactly the same letters in exactly the same order, just got rid of the spaces. So here's the way they were before, that's the way they are with the change in spacing. And now it's trivial for you to remember them, right? So, but when we look at this, it is very hard to see right? Now, luckily, as a dyslexic, it doesn't matter near as much to me as it does to you guys, but right, everyone see that difference? Was it hard before? And now you can remember them really easy. Why? So two things happen. We actually changed the level of context, right, by changing the spacing. But the other reason this is easy to remember is this is not 25 letters, right? This is 5 company names in the text space, right? If I'd made them into words in some foreign language and changed the spacing, it wouldn't help, right? So the relationship here is not just the spacing. It's the relationship between spacing and prior context, prior things you know. So while ATT, right? In fact, I wanted to change this again because I realized that AT&T, literally reading those letters and trying to remember ATT might make you think AT&T. Whereas, so I grouped them in such a way that you're more likely to see map and other words right out of them. But they're not letters. They are things. AT&T, IBM, Apple, Microsoft, Twitter, right? Those are things. And now, I don't know about you, but how many, when you read those words, how many of you see images in your head? Anyone see like an AT&T symbol, an IBM, and the logos, right? Blue Twitter, right? Yeah, see your little icon, right? Companies spend lots of time branding and building their relationship between their name and a visual icon of something. Like IBM's is still like letters, but they're very specific letters, right? And many people, when they go through this, will see them, right? You'll see the little Apple icon, right? Instead of the word Apple, right? And help you remember it. So if you can reduce something to pictures. So the world's best memory, there's a word for it, but no, it's not memories, right? The people who remember really long strings, right? Who can memorize ridiculously lengths of strings. For almost all of them, they remember strings by converting them to visual sequences. They take like strings of 3 or 4 digits, and that becomes a picture for them, right? And then another 3 or 4 strings become a picture. And in fact, for many of the very best people, it's not even a unique mapping. It's not that there's one picture for 1001. They have like 5 or 6 pictures for 1001. Why do you think they might have multiple pictures for the same number sequence?
Because it creates a context to just file into cabinets. You have all those cabinets right there in the line. You just put that specific number to that cabinet.
Right, but this way as I said, the very best people don't have a single number. They'll often have many numbers. Right, so why have multiple numbers for the same subsequence? Well, I'll just answer the question. But the best people who remember these things, right? They use pictures, but the very best ones actually have multiple pictures for the same set of numbers because they want to connect multiple of these, right? So if I take every 4 digits and I make a picture out of them, then I try and put 5 of those together in a row. Those pictures might be hard to remember because there's no connection between them. But if I can use both, a rocket ship and a horse to represent 1001, right? Depending on what the next words are, I can connect rocket ships to stars, to the Milky Way or whatever, horses to grass, to batteries or whatever, right? However I connect them, right? I can make more stories out of them. And as soon as I can remember the story, then it's like, oh, that was this number. Oh, that was this number, right? So the spacing and context become something you can learn, and the proper grouping and prior knowledge lets us put those together in a story. So one more example. And for some of you, it's always fun when I teach it in this class because some of you will relate to this. But see how many of this following 7 sentences you can remember. Okay, who built the boat? Jim, Bob, or so.
The family.
So, in fact, I don't remember who. I have to go back. Okay, so who built the boat? Frank built the boat, right? So there were things being built. There were people, right? And so for me as a dyslexic, names are always really, really hard to learn, right? But they have no context. They have no relevance, right? Nothing there was easy for you to remember. But for those of you who are Americans, right? The following will make this a little bit easier. Okay? Santa walked on the roof. The Easter Bunny picked up the eggs. George Washington hid the axe. Ben Franklin flew the kite, right? Noah built it. Thomas Edison flipped the switch. William Shakespeare, right? At this point in time, you can probably remember almost all of those. For those of you who are not American, it's actually still really hard, right? Do you know who Ben Franklin is? Maybe, right? Do you know the Easter Bunny? Maybe not, right? But context, the shared knowledge of the audience, is a critical thing that makes things memorable and understandable or not. Now, in the world of science, you have to figure out what is the shared knowledge of your audience. And this is one of the most difficult things in telling stories, right? When you tell stories to a family, there's much you admit because they already know or have banks of knowledge, right? So if I'm talking about things that when you're with your family, you're at a gathering, right? With members of your family for a holiday, right? You can tell stories and you have so much shared knowledge between them, you don't have to say much of anything. And they all of a sudden know the entire story, right? Why? Because you have all this shared knowledge. You tell that same story to a friend and they're looking at you like, what? Like, it's not funny, I don't get it, right? Because your friend doesn't have that knowledge, right? Your job when you're trying to write is to figure out what is the knowledge you can and cannot assume about your audience. But there's one part that makes that even worse, which is what we call the curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it is really hard, nearly impossible to remember what it was like to not know it. Okay? Once you know, you tend to write and tell others as if every listener already knew that. It becomes harder and harder the more you become good at something to understand how it is like to not know that thing, right? And so you write it, it's like, of course it's obvious, right? Well, it's obvious to you because you know it. It's not obvious to the reader, they don't know it. But when you start making connections, if you assume the audience knows A, B, and C, because you know A, B, and C, and A, B, and C is how you got to understand D, you got to remember, does the audience actually know A? And do they know B? And do they know C? And if not, you have to give them the context. But it's really, really hard when you don't even remember what you know and what you don't know. Where you learned it from, how do you build on that? So it requires being very conscious and saying, does the audience know this? Does the audience know this? Does the audience know this? As you're writing. So you want to write from the audience's perspective, from the audience's banks of prior knowledge, not from your banks of prior knowledge, right? Not from the best scientist's point of view. At most, you want to write from the average audience member's point of view. But in my view, realistically, you want to write below average, although you want to write in such a way that they feel above average. Right? So that's a stylistic thing, right? You don't want to come across as talking down to them. If you come across as talking down to them, you will tick off lots of readers, right? So you don't want to say like, well, as everyone knows, and then tell them something. Why not? Why don't you start like, as is common knowledge or whatever, right? Because if they don't know it, then you just insulted them, right? So you've got to present it in such a way that you're building up on this, right? So as so-and-so, showed in their paper, and then you present something, right? You didn't make any condescending comments about it. There's no judgment. But you really want to aim at them. Now, that being said, and for standard story writing, forget this. Right? That's where you end. Standard story writing, you're aiming generally well below what you think is the average of the audience. Why do I want to aim well below the average of the audience? What happens if I actually aim right at the average? I lost half the audience. Right? Our goal is not to get half the audience. Our goal is to get most of the audience, which means I have to aim well below average. Right? So it's not talking about the average audience members. You're aiming at 25%, maybe 10%, bottom 10% of the audience, right? Because if they get it, everyone will get it. But I will tell you, from a storytelling view, even that doesn't always work. Why? What happens if I aim for the bottom 10% of my storytelling?
A peer reviewer tells me that I haven't come up with anything new or creative or exciting.
Yeah, so there may not be something, but even, again, not science for a second, but even from a pure storytelling point of view, what happens, right? I'm just telling a story. What happens if I aim at 3rd grade for my audience?
Not interesting to the others.
Right, I might lose the top part of my audience because it's just too low level, right? So finding that balance where instead of viewing it as I'm writing everything for one audience, right? I can have 2 or 3 paragraphs in my paper that are for the absolute best experts. There might be 3 people in the world who really understand what I just said here, but that's okay. In fact, from a reviewer point of view, if there's not some part of this that seems really advanced, they are going to beat you up, right? And maybe it's not quite the best 2 or 3 scientists, but they might have something that they don't understand and they struggle with in your paper. And at a certain level, it's okay if there's a little bit. They'll still beat you up if it's too hard because they're like, no, it wasn't well written, right? So they can't find anything in the paper when you're writing for most reviewers that is beyond them, or they think it's your fault. Why? Because you didn't explain it so I would understand it, right? So even if there's 2 or 3 paragraphs that are really for the best scientists, save that for the camera-ready copy after it's through review. Then you can add a little bit more detail, or you can hope to get lucky and get one of the 2 or 3 best reviewers out of a pool of 700 that are assigned to your paper. It's just not that likely. So as we started about starting to write our facts for our story, right? Turning facts into what's relevant. Sorry, we make facts relevant by turning them into a story, right? So it is 1996 paper on scientific writing, right? Turner made this interesting observation that most science writing, when I went to school, right, the way I was taught to write for science was 3rd person, impersonal, very objective, no personal opinions. And in that style of writing, which you'll still find in various places, right, scientists bury most of the key story elements, right? But by turning around and making those elements into a story, we can actually make it so it's way more interesting and people get the story better. Now, there is one disadvantage to the way we're talking about this from a storytelling point of view. What is wrong with turning our paper into a story from a science point of view?
It becomes too personal and emotional versus abstract, detached.
Right, so we're losing a little bit of our scientific objectivity. In fact, it's not that it's necessarily too personal. When I'm writing a story, I am literally trying to lead the audience down a particular path, right? Which is not, from the pure science point of view, I have a hypothesis and I go out and test it, okay? But I will tell you that even if you have a hypothesis and go out and test it, if you can't get the audience to relate to your work, it won't go anywhere, right? So if you want your science to be well understood and well accepted, you want to follow a good science methodology in doing it. So why is it as scientists we want to do hypothesis and test and not just try and find an experiment that supports our hypothesis? Because we don't want to mislead ourselves. You as a scientist want to understand your story, and then you want to tell the story to the audience. The knowledge that goes into making stuff relevant is very different for you than it is for your audience, right? You do science for you and you write for your audience. So you want to connect those two. So as we tell a story, it can put stuff into a connection. So here's an example of a very simple event. A mother pours milk into a glass. So why is that not a good story? It has some verbal description, there's some details. Mother pours milk into a glass, right? We know she's pouring milk, we know it's a glass, we know it's a mother, okay? But there's a whole bunch of stuff that's unstated. What are the goals? What are the motives, the resolution obstacles, right? That's not very memorable. But if we try and make some things explicit, now, assuming they're true, right? A mother's left side has been paralyzed from a crippling stroke. She fights to regain the use of her left hand. For the first time, she tries a complex action with her left hand. She's determined to pour milk into a glass to prove that she can, right? Now you know why. Otherwise, like, who cares about a mother pouring milk, right? Depends on what your goals are, but this can make the story a lot more sticky. Why? We have motive. We have the sort of unexpected thing, right? when you first start off, right, this sentence here doesn't say anything about a stroke. Now, you've got these unexpected things. You've got a bunch of elements. Now, is that the best way to tell a science story? No, but these are very abstracted versions, right? You've got to find something to connect all the pieces that you want the audience to care about into a story, right? The 8 elements of the story. So, as we go to work in the storytelling process, we're now going to step 2, the science of stories, right? The process is really about merging information, content, with effective storytelling structures. So if you want to write a compelling story for science, but in general, you want to create your theme. You want to create your takeaway message. The theme is something we want the audience to remember, okay? And then you want to search for a core metaphor. And I'll do these first from a pure story point of view, and I'll come back to science, right? We want to define and develop the story's characters. We want to build story elements around that character and adjust for the audience and medium. So when we talk about the theme, right, what do I want the reader to get out of this paper, right? Not what do I want the algorithm to do. What do I want the reader to get out of this, right? What is the reader's motivation when they get away with it, right? It's a takeaway message. And then a core metaphor. So people know what a metaphor is, metaphor and simile, right? So simile, A is like B. A metaphor is something that is a stand-in, that helps people connect with the story. Doesn't have to be the story, right? But when I talk about choosing a mnemonic and an acronym, like Finder, right? Literally, that metaphor of finding somebody with face recognition was what I was going for, right? The name of my system became my metaphor, right? Relates to what I want to try and do. Literally, the title is sometimes related to the metaphor, right? In one of the papers we recently did, still under review, the title was something like "Finding the Elephant in Object Detection." Right? Throughout the paper, we had some images with elephants, but the whole point was the elephant in the room is an American idiom for the big unstated problem that no one notices, right? There's an elephant in the side of the room, and we're talking about other stuff. No one notices the elephant. So that was our metaphor, that this was a big unsolved problem. The title, and then we work it throughout the paper. So once we have that, we're going to build story elements around the character and the metaphor, right? The character is our algorithm, but the metaphor then becomes a way of helping to tell the story, right? We didn't need to have any pictures of elephants. We chose elephants, and we chose the title for this whole storytelling element of unstated assumptions that people don't want to talk about, right? And that helps the audience remember and build where we're going to go. And then, obviously, we adjust some stuff for the audience, right? So I mentioned the difference between goals, themes, and goals and motives, and then the theme, right? So there is the goal, which is what the character is trying to do, right? It should be physical, tangible, identifiable. Here is the measurable thing I want to measure about my system versus some other system. And it should be explicit that you have that as a goal. Effectively, the goal defines the story's ending in any story. When you reach your goal, the story's pretty much over. You might have some resolution and final party or whatever, but the prince has now defeated the dragon. Now the story's pretty much over. Yeah, there's an award ceremony and whatever else. Right? It creates purpose and meaning for the story. Right? All of these are things for the goal. But the theme, which is actually, in my view, the more important part from a good science story, is for the reader. And the motive connects the goal to the theme at some level. It relates to the human condition. It's what the writer wants the reader to ponder, to think about. And lets the readers interpret the characters and events, and the characters not even be aware of the theme. There's plenty of stories where the theme is going on outside of what the characters are. In fact, the characters being unaware of it is an important part of the way the story works. Because if the characters were aware of the theme, that karma is a bitch and comes back and haunts them, right? They would probably change their behavior. But the whole point of the story is the characters have their goals, they have all their trials and tribulations, and we're trying to get the audience to understand the theme. Right? So those two can be very separated and be very effective at being where it's going to go. So the theme is the core of your message. And the story is the vehicle that effectively communicates the message and can help the message stick. Right? So when I talk about working with my students to figure out what is the story, it also actually includes the theme. Because to me, I see these two as so tightly intertwined. The theme is the message I want to get across. And then the story becomes, okay, here's what we want to say, how do we put them together, right? In fact, the message we want to get across is normally not something we spend a lot of time trying to figure out. We already know that. We started down this research path. Here's what we want to do. But how do I connect them in a story? And we might toss out 5 or 6 story ideas for the same paper. We have the same theme. How do I connect them? What do I relate them to? Now, and we want to do that in such a way that makes them stick. Now, turns out that when we're working on that story and the theme, there's some elements we have to worry about, because what do I want is part of my story? What do I need in my story? I have to be able to relate it to the audience. So how does choosing the story relate to the audience, right? One way is I have a story I want to tell, now I have to tailor it to the audience. But from a science point of view, I often get to choose the story. So how might I use my knowledge of the audience to figure out what story might work?
Like, I mean, all that are working in particular fields, and just by reading and doing a survey of work in the field, we know the problems, the things that are being encountered. We know the challenges that are happening. So it helps us to identify problems which are going to already have a built-in audience that are interested in that solution.
Well, so in fact, it goes a little deeper than that. As you're doing the survey, right, you might actually notice that there's 2 audiences that have overlap, right? So the Venn diagram between these 2 audiences is not empty, but they actually view the problem very differently. So again, well, most of you are security majors, so I'll use security examples, right? So I could be looking at a problem from an attacker point of view versus security from an insider point of view, right? External threats, internal threats, right? Those 2 don't necessarily, they both exist, they're both security related, but some conferences will have more of a focus than another. In fact, and my algorithm might have roles as a defensive mechanism for the external threats and for the internal threats. In fact, if I look at it right, it might even have a role from a privacy point of view. There's a third audience out there, right? So literally, I might be thinking of the work, and when we talk about venue selection, that's another part of how we look at it. What's the audience for the story I can think of that I want to tell? So if I'm going to write for a practical audience, I have to tell a story that will motivate practical oriented audiences. If I'm writing for a more academic audience, I might need something that builds on that. And if I'm looking for a more theoretical audience, I might build on that. So I can choose my story for the audience, or I can look at the audience and say, what story can I tell for that audience? What story can I tell for that audience? Now there's a second element that goes back into that sort of trying to figure out the relationship between the theme and the story. Because I said the theme is the core of what I want to get across. The story I choose to communicate that to a particular audience. Okay? Another way of looking at it is from the audience point of view, from a science audience point of view, what papers have been recently published that I can connect my story to their story? Because if I continue their story, right, then I've got a much broader knowledge base. That paper already set a bunch of knowledge and terminology in a path that I follow. Then I have a natural story audience. Why? Because everyone who's read that paper, I can assume they have a shared knowledge having read that paper. Every paper you cite becomes part of your shared knowledge base for some group of people. And if I can find 5 or 6 papers that a lot of people have read that are recent, and I then make my story tied to how they told their stories, I get to connect mine to theirs. If I go to a different conference, I have different papers. Now, there's a reason to cite papers from that conference, right? Sometimes they'll tell you to cite them because they want to bump up their numbers. There might be something to that, but a lot of the reason to cite papers from that conference are because the reviewers for your paper are generally pulled from people who have published in that conference or that venue. So if you're choosing members of the reviewer pool by citing them, you increase the chance you'll get a reviewer that understands your story and will have a shared knowledge base because you're citing their papers as part of that knowledge base. You're assuming the readers have read some of this stuff. the standard software that's used by a bunch of fields that try and match reviewers and papers literally goes through the papers the reviewers have published and does a similarity match between those papers and your papers. So if you can find people in that audience, you get a knowledge base so that your story more effectively communicates. Because the more shared knowledge you have, the more you can buy into that knowledge. Okay, so coming back to the bare bones 8-element story. Here is a single sentence story. In fact, there's a whole like Reddit subforum, I think it's Reddit, like on two, or maybe it's a TV show now too, like 2-sentence stories, right? Can you tell an entire story in 1 or 2 sentences? There was actually a competition for the shortest story, which I think was 6 words, at least in that particular competition. So the bare bones essential elements, the 8 elements in a single sentence. The character needed blank because blank, but blank, so blank, finally, whatever, right? That single sentence structure gets you all of the elements of a good story. So what do you think is missing, by the way? Yeah, I see someone counting, right? There are 8 elements. There's only 6 here, right? Okay. So yeah, the character here, right, depends on how you describe it, right? If I just said mother, right, that's a character, right? Mother had, recovering alcoholic mother, right? Now it's a character, so I can add some descriptions to go in there. And then there's details, right? So the sort of character traits and the details are missing from this. And you can have a story without them. It's a less exciting story, right? Now I'm going to go back and relate that. So Oscar, our way of telling a story, right? Oscar is recursive. It can be applied all over the place. So here's our single sentence opening, some character, setting, needed something, challenge, because whatever, but whatever. So challenge and setting are between these 2 sentences, right? Action, so something happens, and then resolution, finally, right? A good story sentence covers these Oscar elements, even in a single sentence. And if you can relate the core of your paper in 1 sentence or 2 sentences, right, the reader gets it right away, right? You've now got a good opening for your paper. If you can get them in the abstract with 2 sentences, 1 sentence, you're in good shape. As long as you don't decide it's too trivial. So as I said, Oscar can be applied recursively. So it occurs at the paper level. It occurs at the section level, okay? And I sort of went through those before already. But it can even be applied at the paragraph level. A good paragraph has an opening. It has some of the other elements, right? But so S and C can become much smaller, right? Because we don't have to worry as much about them. But we should have the opening. We should have a little bit of conflict. We should have a little bit of resolution. The setting may be implied because we've already had lots of paragraphs before it, right? The challenge, again, depends on where we are. So you might have those, right? At the sentence level, it's not often, but sometimes reports are there. More oftenly, sentences will be viewed in a smaller version of an opening element of the sentence, an action and a resolution, or, depending on the context, you can actually vary it a little bit and have resolutions followed by action. This happened because of that, right? If you do traditional writing classes, they'll talk about trying to vary your style and whatever. We'll come back to that. It's less of an important that you have these variations in style, but it is important that you think about your sentence structure from a storytelling point of view. You want to keep connecting these elements. Once you have your story ideas, you want to focus on organizing them for your readers. So we talked about now trying to get the shared audience model and the shared knowledge, but how do I organize those to put them together? So tell me what you see here. Okay. Yeah.
You just touched on like writing in a different manner.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say in writing classes. So and in scientific fields also authors substitute vary between a set of words that mean the same thing.
So we'll come back to that in just a bit. So I was talking about variety of style, not variety of phrases, but we'll come back to that. So so again, everything I'm telling you in this class is my view of these things, right? So variety, if we'll come back. We'll just do the variety stuff now, right? So, to people who are going to read your stuff many, many times, variety is important. How often do you expect a reader to read your paper? Once, twice, right? They'll scan it, but they're only going to read it once or twice, right? So variety is not near as important for a writer as it is for an author of a novel, right? The other is, we're not talking about 200 pages. I'm talking 8 or 10, right? So you don't necessarily need to have a huge amount of variety. In fact, at a certain level for word choice, variety is both good and bad. Variety in verbs, generally good. Variety in nouns, bad. Because every time I describe the same object 2 different ways, I run the risk of the reviewer or the audience thinking they're 2 different objects. Why? Because I described them differently. Right? If I meant the same object, I should have said the same phrase to describe the same object. If we go far enough down the path, and I'm talking about patents, right, a very technical writing, if I use 2 phrases to the patent examiner, it means 2 different objects. Because I should use the same phrase over and over again for the same object. Right? So you can get a variety in how you connect things, but if I'm talking about the same system, I should have the same phrase for it every time. Otherwise, I've confused the reader. Why am I doing it differently? Right? If I'm talking about a property of my system, I should use the same phrase every time because it's the same property. Right? I shouldn't name it twice, right? Which is different than lots of traditional writing where they say, well, here it's beautiful and here it's colorful. It's like, I'm sorry, beautiful and colorful are 2 very different words, right? An object might be beautiful and colorful, but if I'm describing its properties, I should be consistent about how I want to describe it. Okay, so these have been up here for a very long time. Way more important. Can anyone describe this? Okay, so part of what I'm heading at is this idea of learning to frame what's important, right? So if in my story it was actually really important, the little pieces that might describe elements of my algorithm or whatever, right? They're easily lost in the details. You can't connect this. But if I describe this as, right, a chair by the shore, in the grass, right, or, something like that, right, you can easily remember all of that and connect it. Your story about framing what's important, right, the pieces of the grass, the chair, the shoreline, right, if those are important, connect them somehow. Don't leave them as isolated little pieces and find a way to make them to come together. So as you can frame them and put them into a single picture, okay? In fact, your exercise for next week will be to look at things from a pictorial point of view. Right? Putting together a picture or 2 or 3 that help explain it is also an important part of storytelling. Because if you can't visualize it, if you can't think of a picture, it's really hard to get the audience to remember what you're talking about. But if I connect them in a picture, then I can help the audience connect them, right? And that's part of what we want to do. So very often when we're talking about trying to find the story for our paper, my students and I talk about it from a figure diagram point of view. If I want to show I'm better than something, how am I going to show it in a plot, in a graph? Because if I can only show it by a number, it's much harder, right? It's only one piece of information. There's a lot of information, so how am I going to show it? But we'll think about how to visualize what it means, not just in the performance plot, but something else help them understand how it works or why it works. Because that frames everything to put it back together in a much more meaningful way. This is hard, right? Here I gave you an example. It's generally easy to see this after the fact. The hard part is generating. As I said, my students and I will come up with 3 or 4 different ideas, and we'll change the story of the paper because we can't figure out how to display that story. But we can figure out how to tell this story and connect it. Right? And that's part of the early parts of a paper, long before you start writing lots of it. Because if you write lots of it, it is experienced many times over. Once you've written stuff, you don't want to change it. You don't want to go throw it away. So better to brainstorm with just some pictures and some high-level ideas to connect them. So the opening, the beginning of your paper, is critical to framing the paper. The first sentence is very audience-specific. But as I'm trying to frame that, the first sentence is aimed at this audience. What do I need to know about that? What is the goal of that first sentence if I'm trying to relate it to the audience? Well, I do want them to read the second sentence, right? So we want it to be a hook, sort of intellectually or emotionally for the audience. So when you read that sentence, you have to think this paper is about something I work on, something I care about. Because if the first sentence of the paper says, this is a paper on natural language interpretation by American Indians, are any of you reading the rest of this paper? No. They've told you right up front what this paper is about, and it's not for you. Now, if the audience was people who are studying Native American Indians, right, then that might be relevant, but maybe not for you, right? So it's actually good and bad to make that opening sentence as general as possible, but as narrow as reasonably true. Because you don't want people to read farther and then get ticked that this is really not right. At least 2 of you read papers where you felt there was a bait and switch in the last couple of weeks, where it's like, the abstract seemed great, it was like going over here, and then the paper was like, what, it's over here, it has nothing to do with what I'm reading, right? It's actually not uncommon, right? It occurs because people will often write the abstract for the paper they wanted to write, then they write the paper, and it of course wanders over here, and they never go back and rewrite the abstract. So oddly enough, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on this in the beginning, but a whole lot of time after you're done the paper. So our standard way of writing for this is you actually write some abstract, some intro sentences to capture where you want to go, then you write the paper, then you go back and you rewrite that first sentence of the abstract and the first sentence of the introduction to make it as big a frame as you can reasonably justify. Right? So when we talked about that Oscar funnel, right? That first sentence is really, really broad. And then you work your way. Now, it's not ridiculously broad. You don't want to include all of science. That's as broad as you could get as a science paper, but it's probably too broad. You got to narrow it down. So as we're looking at the sort of setting the scene, right? The second part of Oscar, openings, setting the scene. So the intro should have a bit of setting the science and the problem. Okay, maybe even a little bit about the danger. When we talk about the storytelling elements, right, they don't show up in exactly one place in Oscar, right? So the setting has some bit of the context, some bit of the problem, and maybe a little bit of our danger. Okay, what is the most relevant existing science, and why should we care? Now, even if I have a whole section called related work, right, I still want to put some of this in the intro, right? We want to make sure we also define any non-standard important items. This is especially true if I'm going to use them throughout the paper. But if I need them in here to define my contributions, I absolutely want to define them. Because I want to end my intro with a section that says, here's my contributions to this paper. And if I don't get to those contributions, unless I understand some of these terms, then I have to define those terms. Better if I have non-standard terms to find a way to describe my contributions without them, but if you get stuck, you would do them. Okay? The intro is not a place to do a literature review. If you're going to have this related work section, you can separate the detailed discussion of other people's papers to that section. But why do I need to have some related work in the intro? Even if I have a section called related work, why do I want some in the intro?
Part of it is that chances are nobody's ever heard of any of us in this room. So by having some in the intro basically ties you to the greater context which they're already aware of.
Right. So in fact, we want the audience to be aware of this work is like somehow related to these. We're trying to set up and establish our problem, right, is important, right? So if I go back to sticky stories, right, I got to have some part of credibility in here, right? In the intro, I can't establish the credibility of this problem. But if I'm citing a paper from, this 5 or 6 groups of people or, whatever, that have shown that this is important, then I've now established some part of the problem. But also, very often, I have to advance beyond what those people did. It's hard to say how I advanced if I don't say what they did, right, who they are, right? So and you don't want to come across as not knowing what else is out there. So you need to have a little bit of that in there. Most reviewers and most readers will read the introduction. Lots of them will skip the related work section until later. Right? So despite the fact that lots of papers it is the second section, it's often skipped over. I'll come back to that later. Right? I'll read the intro, then I'll read the contributions and approach. Right? Why? Why would most reviewers skip over or at most scan the related work section? They're already familiar with most of the related work. In fact, if they're reading for it, they're really trying to figure out, where's my paper in here? Right? It's like, what? Oh, my paper's not in here. Okay, you got to put that away. But so it's important now. But for people who have not read, they're going to come back and they're going to read that related work section before they go deep into your approach, because they need to know, here's the common knowledge, right? So different members of the audience, right? Reviewers who know all that stuff will skim through it very quick. Those who don't may say, oh, here's what that relation is, here's how it is, here's what I need to understand, right? And if you're stuck doing the depth first approach, some readers will say, oh look, I need to go read these papers before I read that. Hopefully I've cured you of that process, right? You no longer read all the related work before you read this one, but it can give you some context of what's going on. The goal here is to find the most important papers that help frame the problem and showing the readers that others are working in related areas too. Okay? So in the intro, you might be citing the most significant, widely cited papers in the broad literature, even if they're not from this venue. In the related work section, you might actually get to some of the narrower papers from this venue. As I said, you want to cite some of them and understand what they are, right? But those might not be the most widely read. So if I'm going to cite a paper that's got 2,000 citations and one that's got 30, which one do I put in the intro? The one with 2,000. Why? Because lots of people have said that paper is important. It's got a broad audience. The 20 or 30 is about being the technically highly relevant stuff to what I'm doing, right? So you don't want the most narrowly related papers in the intro. You want to tell a broad story of that broad problem. It's framing it, okay? Now, especially in the intro, but even in general when you're dealing with a paper, anytime you're citing somebody, you want to be positive and not come across as overly critical. And this becomes tricky because one of our goals is what?
Winning our audience.
Well, we got to win the audience, but from a storytelling point of view, some of the 8 elements, what do we want to do? Well, I want to solve the problem. So there's a problem, right? I've got to identify that there is a problem worth solving. So at a minimum, I have to say, these people didn't solve my problem, right? So I can't be all positive because I got to point out that there is a problem worth solving. So if we're looking at the challenge, when I'm reciting them, right, is to find your problem, conflicts, risk, and dangers, right? As you're dealing with the related literature in the intro section, you've got to make it clear why these problems aren't solved. But you can do that in a way that's positive. You can say, so-and-so made great strides towards this, okay? But there's still a way to go, right? So the sort of elements that are positive, and if you really want to make it a little bit more positive, you can even do it as a bad news sandwich, right? So-and-so did this, but the problem is not completely solved, while this other paper or while that group, right, has made significant advances, right? You can put the negative things in the middle. They're still there. But you've got to get some level of the problems exist. Conflicts, risks, and dangers, right? Those don't have to be related to a particular person, okay? In fact, from a citation point of view, you rarely want to talk about the person, you want to talk about the paper. So this paper shows, right? You don't say this paper, or this person shows, right? It's this paper shows. Although a couple of you had a citation style where you kept just using numbers, right? You can't use numbers as a noun, right? You can't use a citation number as a noun in a sentence. You can't replace they or this group of people or Bolt et al, right? You gotta have some noun in your sentences, but and that actually depends on the style. There are people for whom it's perfectly fine if you're using, say, APA style, where they list all the authors, then it's actually considered okay to use the list of authors as a noun because it's a bunch of people's names. But if it becomes the number 3 in square brackets, you don't use it that way. And again, when we talk about trying to tell the story, figuring out what are the problems, conflicts, risks, and dangers, right? That's your job as the writer, to figure out how I tell those things, right? They're always there. Right? If you're doing science, it's because something is not known, right? Something is not solved. But how to present that from a story point of view? What are the other conflicts? Very often in computer science, in our science stories, right, there are inherent conflicts. Speed often takes more memory, or more energy, or something, right? There's lots of things in our space where we have an inherent trade-off. And anytime there's an inherent trade-off, that provides a conflict. I do this, but that. That's our conflict. Risks and dangers are a little trickier, but very often the risks and dangers relate back to the problem. It's like, if I do this, I might cause, I might take more memory, right? And very often when you're actually doing your science, you actually do it from a point of view is, I might have these negative side effects. So I did this in my algorithm to address this one, and this in my algorithm to address that one, right? So lots of algorithmic papers or systems papers are not one thing, but one big thing and a couple of little things. And the little things are there to address added risks and dangers that were introduced. As I tried to solve this, I introduced these subproblems. So I added these pieces. And if you present them that way, right? Here's the problem. If I do this, I might cause these. So we address them that way. It makes them connected, okay? Stories are not necessarily about failure. It's okay to talk about failure. It's good to talk about the ones you have, but they're challenges along the road to success. So you want to show that this path was complicated as you work through it, but it does mean they're going to be there. Now, does danger automatically mean physical danger? Absolutely not. If I'm going to have a good story, any danger will do. Emotional danger, mental danger, societal danger, professional or physical danger will do, right? So there might be something like, this algorithm simply won't run on the computer I need to put it on to send to Mars. If that's the story you're telling, right? And you'll see lots of papers where they almost invent little places to have the danger to overcome it, because they're trying to get some part of their audience to understand that this is real. There's a problem here that we've got to solve. Now, lots of ways of getting there. Things like embarrassment, rejection, lack of knowledge, understanding, lack of information, failure, ridicule, belittlement. All of these are negatives, right? These are dangers, right? Like, I could make a decision because it took too long. I couldn't make a decision because I didn't have the input information, right? And you're trying to solve. Depends on what your problem is. Find a way to describe some of it as a danger and think about it. And then sooner or later, if you can describe it as a danger, you'll be able to work it somewhere into your paper as part of your story. But if you don't think about it, if you don't think about those 8 story elements, it's easy to overlook lots of them because you're not used to thinking that way. So in science, accuracy, speed, costs, those are all dangerous, right? They're things we care about, so we can put them together. So the next element of Oscar was our resolution. So in our resolution, in a good story, there's something that sort of brings it all together. At the end of a science paper, there can be 2 different common or 3 different names. The most common are conclusions versus discussion, and another is summary. I actually don't recommend you write papers with summaries. Why? Because those are just summaries, right? If you already had an abstract, you sort of summarize a lot there. So if you think about what's going to happen to somebody who reads the abstract and then jumps to your conclusion should say something other than what you said in the abstract. So that's where we would have a true conclusion or a discussion. And so what do you think is the difference between conclusion and discussion? Discussion is broader. So what do you mean by broader?
Like we touch on the problem, the methodology, but also expand into other topics, I guess.
Okay. You can do a lot with conclusions, but okay, so I can see there are definitely other discussions will often touch on other topics.
Discussion, we usually go through results. Like, we did this here and we saw this happen. Our conclusion is, okay, big picture, this is what we did.
So in fact, I would not consider the second one a conclusion. I would call it a summary.
Summary.
Right?
Okay.
Which is, here's what we did, conclusion. So to me, a conclusion really is, here is a bunch of things we observed from which we can conclude this. Right? The word conclusion is about the conclusion. Now you can have a bunch of other stuff in it, you can have more than one conclusion in a section called conclusion, but it's really not a summary, right? Because it's all about the final conclusions from those experiments. A discussion, on the other hand, is more appropriate when you can't draw a conclusion. We observed a bunch of things. We don't know why. Right? We observe these things, and we have some inkling that it could be this, but future experiments will do it. So, in fact, a common other phrase is not a section called conclusion. Conclusion in future work is often a little bit closer to discussion because, like, we reach this conclusion, but here's the things that we don't understand. More people need to work on. So, as I said, so some people like to put it in a section called conclusion in future work. My view about future work is it's much better to put in the body of the method, in the method section or the experimental section, and then no need to re-summarize it at the end. So conclusions in future work separate the future work from where you had the experiments or the issues that came up. But why also is it not a good idea to put future work at the end from a reviewer point of view?
Maybe makes it look like what you did was incomplete.
Yeah, right. So you end up with, okay, but it's not solved, right? So why should I accept your paper? Because you haven't solved your problem. So if you do conclusions in future work, you're asking for them, you're giving them the ammunition to shoot you, saying, yes, but this, do this, and this, and then come back. Okay? That's why I like to view it as sort of the bad news sandwich. There's work that's not done. You put that in the experimental section someplace. Yeah, we did this, but yeah, maybe some other directions should need to look at this. But when you get to the conclusions, you want to be positive and forceful. Here's what we did. Here's what you can conclude. Okay? Now, so there's room in a paper for future work, but you should end strong, right? This is all about the resolution. The resolution isn't that there's more stuff to do. The resolution is, we did this. We solved this. Here's our conclusion. And put the other stuff early. So if you have a section that is conclusion of future work, even in that section, you can start with the future work, right? But then also end with conclusion. But my recommendation is don't call it conclusion of future work. Put the future work someplace up in the experimental section for further experimentation or whatever.
I think I've seen on the papers, future work is after.
Yeah, that's-
I absolutely agree.
I've seen it in
I've
a
seen,
lot of work.
I've seen it in lots and lots of papers, and I'm trying to convince you why not to do it. Okay? So have I done it? Actually, I have done it lots of times too, right? It took me a long time to learn some of these lessons, right? I was taught by people like, these are where they are, right? And conclusion and future work was literally the names of some of the sections I was told to write. It's like, okay, then I'll do that, right? And at the time, so if I look at it from a different point of view, one of your goals of your paper is to get people to see there is future work. We talked about persuading somebody to follow on, right? So if I end with future work, I'm asking them to follow on. In fact, to be honest, some of the times when I've added future work, it's because after the reviewing, I add future work, right? The reviewers don't see a section called conclusion and future work. The final paper does. Why? And sometimes it's because the reviewers gave me feedback. It's like, oh, here's some other things that you should be able to do. But if the paper is accepted and I'm not doing them in this paper, then I'll put them as future work, right? Make it easier for the reader. But mostly it's because I've had way too many papers rejected because what I put in the future work section comes back as my review. The paper's not done. Come back in after you've done these things, right? It doesn't take me too long after being hit with a stick to recognize, don't put your foot out there for them to hit you.
Or just don't even put it in a future work section.
Don't even put a
Yeah.
future work, right? Yeah.
Do that for your next edit.
Right. Well, as I said, I've sometimes done it after the fact, but as I said, I like to put it actually closer to the experiments because realistically, the people, if they're thinking about doing follow-on work, they've probably read your experiments. And your experiments are when it's easier to describe what that future work is in context instead of after you've now gone back and finished the session and gone on the reader. And in the paper, it might actually be just moved up like 2 inches, right? And in the experimental section, conclusion section, but keep your conclusions. Right? So, some general comments on writing. So in the next 2 weeks, you're going to be working on your paper, right? So these are general things now, no longer related to storytelling. I'm just really jumping back into getting ready to write. So I guess before that, any more questions on storytelling and writing from the core content? No? Okay. So common styles on writing. Start early. Work on the story before writing too much and before doing any or all of the experiments. You should know what story you're trying to tell before you go and run your experiments. And a good story, right, doesn't depend on the outcome, right? So you have your character. They're gonna fight this battle and something will happen and then they will get there. Now, unfortunately, from a science point of view, if they get there and they didn't beat the state of the art, you may not have a paper, right? But that's the outcome. So the story dies. It's not bad that you figured out what the story was and then ran the experiments. You're not going to say, well, I'm going to fix the data so that I get the story. That's cheating. But you're going to know what you're trying to do. And as I said, I think I've said this before, right? One of the reasons you want to do that is once you figure out what the story is, once you know what figures you want to try and do, you want to make sure you collect the data that lets you draw those figures. Because you don't want to run an experiment that takes 2 weeks of computer time only to realize you didn't save the parameters you need or the intermediate stages you need to draw the figure to tell your story. If you know what that story is and you know here's how I want to show it, then you'll collect that information during your experiment, which is one of the other reasons to do it before you get done. You want to edit often, literally editing the story, not just the text, right? Review how the story works with the experimental results. Do some preliminary experiments, get some early results and say, are those consistent with our story? If not, how do I change the story? Or what other experiments might? Not that I recommend it, but there are definitely a bunch of papers out there and people I know who, at this point, if I get science that's not consistent with the data set, I have my science, I go out and run experiments, they're not consistent with my story, I can choose to what we call data set shopping. Not that I recommend it, but you should be aware it exists. You basically say, well, I ran it on this data set and it doesn't work. So in my field of computer vision, there's a lot of people who use MNIST as a data set. It's a very common data set. It's also extremely weird. It's pretty much black and white, even though it's got some shades of gray. It's pretty much a black and white, hand-drawn letters that were very tightly cropped. They're all perfect. And you'll get algorithms that work fine on that and fail on other data sets. Okay? And so the interesting thing, so I run an experiment. I do not beat state-of-the-art on MNIST. I don't stop. Because I may not beat them on MNIST, but I might beat them on street house view numbers, which is really also just numbers. But they're numbers under a more realistic setting, right? Or not, maybe I'm not good with numbers. Maybe I need more complicated things like animals, or CFAR, or the right data set. Now, that's not necessarily bad science, but you do got to change your story. Somewhere along the way, I said you'll talk about the things you failed at. It's like you can include or just have a sentence or two, right? This algorithm did not outperform state-of-the-art on MNIST, but, and then you're right, so you're talking about those limitations. Why? There's something about that data set that's not consistent with your assumptions, without where your model is, right? For example, if my model only works well in high dimensions, then MNIST, which is only 700 pixels, may simply not work for something that needs 1,000 dimensions, 1,000 classes, each of which have 1,000 dimensions, right? Because I need a higher dimensional space for my algorithm to really work. There's going to be lots of things. But as you review those experimental results, it helps you change your story. This is an algorithm for high dimensional spaces. I might not have started with that as being my story, but as I recognize it doesn't work well in low dimensions, but it does in high, I change my story so the audience instantly knows where I'm going and gets the context. Edit some more, get some feedback, edit even more, and iterate on this process. One of the reasons I push you to use Git is from my experience, a good paper will have lots of iterations. We have tons of papers in my lab for which by the time we finish the paper, the Git log has more than 200 commits, right, in one paper. Why? Because you do a little bit of editing, somebody commits. Do a little bit of editing, somebody commits. Now, if you're writing entirely by yourself, you might not see all of those, right? And actually, if you look at what happens in Overleaf, Overleaf is even more aggressive because like you type 10 characters, if you stop typing for more than like 15 seconds, it doesn't commit because it doesn't want to lose your work. So I have no idea how many you get in that, but well, I'm talking about much larger commits where members of our team are editing and putting stuff together. But a good paper will go through dozens, if not hundreds, of major edits and a whole bunch of minor edits. And as you tell that story, don't be afraid to let it evolve because that's a good part of you learning from your writing. A couple of sort of common sins that I like to get rid of in papers, right? What I call the grandmotherhood openings, right? Everyone loves their grandmother, right? Almost everyone loves their grandmother. You don't want to say something like, computer vision is an important field, okay? If they're in computer vision, they probably believe that. If so, they're right. But if to say something like, object detection is an important problem in computer vision, right? I've now chosen a sub area and I'm talking about why is that important. That's a little bit better, right? It's still pretty motherhoody because almost everybody in computer vision recognizes, right? But large scale or online object, make it broad enough but narrow as much as you reasonably can for what you want to do. Okay? One of the ones that really drives me nuts is a table of contents in paragraph form. In section 2, we will do this. In section 3, we'll do this. In section 4, we'll do that. This is especially annoying in conference papers that all have the same 7 sections, right? Intro, or of course we're going to see that, right? If you have nothing better to say in your paper, right, don't tell me that. cut it out and put a figure in. Give me some new information. I know the order in which now, if you're really going to do something different, and you're going to make related work last, and I've seen papers where related work is just before conclusions, right? Then you might say, well, in this paper, we've moved the related work until after our experiments to put them in context, right? Don't just tell me what, tell me why, right? You made some. There's times where it's meaningful, but most of the time, this is bad, okay? Don't undercut yourself with textbook level material. People sometimes feel they need to have equations in their paper, so they go get some equations that you would have had from your undergraduate textbook and put them in their paper. Don't, right? If somebody doesn't understand that basic level material, give them some citations, right? Find some much more advanced equations about your work, not stuff that is so generic it's been boiled down and taught at the undergraduate level, because it just doesn't really help the credibility of the paper. Unless you're an undergrad writing for an undergraduate journal, then it might be okay. In general, you want to do that. Conclusions that don't conclude, a summary of we did this, this, and this are not a conclusion, right? So in the conclusion, actually say, these experiments allow us to conclude whatever. You don't have to use the word conclude, but you should be talking about relating experiments and other analysis to the final outcomes. It is good to use the word contribution in your conclusion section, right? So I actually recommend the end of your intro section will literally be a bulleted list of contributions. And then in the conclusions, you take those lists and you say, these experiments allow us to conclude whatever your contribution is, right? So we made a state-of-the-art algorithm, right? That's in your intro. In the conclusion section, these experiments show that on this data set, right, we outperformed the state-of-the-art by this much, right? Now, is that a summary or is it a conclusion? Well, it's a connection of the data to the conclusion that supports it. So that's a conclusion to put it together. And then it also really annoys me when the opening and conclusion have a mismatch. If you have n items of contributions, every one of those should show up in the conclusion section, right? But now it's relating to how you drive the conclusion. In the intro, you just say you did. In the conclusion section, you relate them and connect them. So coming back to the question about variety, okay, I actually recommend you highlight information by repeating it. Okay, major ideas should be in several places in your document, but don't copy the text. My view is, in the different places in the document, you want to highlight the most important things by giving different views of it. So in the intro, you sort of state something. In the approach section, you explain how you do it. In the experimental section, you explain how you analyze it, but you still have some of the same description of it. Why? Because they're the major ideas. You want to make sure they get hit in multiple places. After a reviewer's done reviewing your paper, you want them to remember it. Okay? The second thing is actually repeat the same keywords. For a particular noun, you should describe it exactly one way. Because if you describe it two different ways, people think it might be two different things, right? Don't go for variety to keep it being competitive. You may read this 100 times. That also makes it seem more repetitive to you. Readers generally read it 1 or 2 times, so it's not nearly repetitive as you might think. If you've used it less than 20 times, go ahead and reuse it, as it's not really that repetitive yet. Or find a way to rewrite it without ever using it, right? So you can use pronouns, but I don't recommend too many pronouns. Right? Pronouns are tough, right? Because if I say the, it, right? Literally from a grammatical point of view, it should be used in context, but it's often, if a sentence has 2 nouns, right? It. Now which one is it? There are 2 different nouns. I don't know which one it means, right? It's very confusing. So for people for whom English is not their first language, the rules of association are hard. Better to use it in a way. Now, if it's a long phrase, like deep network, right? You can reduce it to CNN or DNN, right? You can reduce it, right? When you introduce it, you capitalize the first letters, you put the acronym after it, then you use those throughout. That's good. If you have a name you're not sure of and you're worried that you don't want to keep using it, my recommendation, and this also helps you use it the same way every time, define a LaTeX macro that says /my system, open brace, or new command or def my system, make something that literally is the name of my system, and then later on when I want to change it, I can change it everywhere by changing that one macro. Especially if you're not sure what you want to call it, don't just keep calling it my algorithm. Have a macro that says /new command /my algorithm or our algorithm, which you'll get tired of typing after a while. You can just say OA for whatever, and then you put in squiggly braces the name, right? So you can just look up how to do that, and then you can use it everywhere throughout your paper, and you will never have to worry about like did I change it consistently? Oddly enough, even though it's only 8 pages, it's still annoying to have to do it. But you do want to avoid instant repetition or tautologies, right? Tautologies are things like basic, fundamental, final editing, true facts, mutual cooperation. Those are 2 words of just tautology. You don't need both of them. But also, don't have 2 sentences that say the same thing, unless you really intentionally want to really emphasize this. So when you have more than one audience, I might have one sentence that says it by relating it to object A that audience 1 knows about, and another sentence that relates it to item B that group 2 knows about, right? So I can sort of say, this is like that, which is also like this, right? And I'm now related to 2 different audiences to help them understand what's going to go on. And then some of these are things I did last time. So manage your time. Don't think about writing. This is about communication. Generate ideas. One of the things I didn't do in terms of using outlines, right? After you've been working on your story, right? I then recommend taking the story to outline how am I going to achieve this story. Here's my characters. Here's the items, right? So it's not an outline in the order of the paper. It's these are the elements of the story. And I actually like to think of this as more like a brainstorming outline than a traditional outline, right? What if I tell them in this order? What if I tell them in that order? As you've already seen, the order of what's near each other is very important for the human understanding. And you want to both be very cognizant about that and plan for it as you tell your story. So if I swap these 2 paragraphs, it's changed the order of things, which will change how people interpret it. So you want to think about your outline from that point of view, and maybe put it together. If you're struggling with how to present stuff, you can use some of these brainstorming things where, like, you can only use verbs or words that rhyme, words that start with a particular letter. This is another technique to help you. Oddly enough, adding constraints makes us often more creative, because when you have too many choices, you don't choose anything. But if I now have to choose things that will rhyme, it will force me to force things going. And the post-it notes, free writing, and free talk, those are things we talked about a little bit last class. So for next week, I will post the assignment, but I would like you to do, so keep working towards your survey paper. Last week I asked you to do a mind map, and 1/2 of you did a real mind map. This week, my only thing is for you to come up with a storyline that has the 8 core story elements and 3 figures, hand drawing, crappy, I don't care what they are, right, that help you tell that story as though it was a cartoon, right? At least 3. It can be 5 or 6 if it takes you that far to go, right? So, but important is for you to keep reading papers. If you're going to build a survey paper, you need to find enough papers to fill that in if you're doing your research, right? The fact that you found a survey paper that's got a bunch of papers, focus for this next week on what new papers are that they're not in there. That's really tough if they publish stuff through May, right? And it's really hard to figure out which ones they didn't cite. So you might instead focus not on trying to find just new papers, but what story can I tell that's so different from theirs? How can I organize my information? Because the storytelling is related to that. As I tell a story, it's about how I organize the information, right? So there's got to be some new way of telling that story. So just work on that. And then keep reading papers. Okay? Thank you.